Some mafia bosses are so feared and powerful that they live like ghosts, impossible to reach, impossible to kill. Semion Mogilevich, the Russian mafia invisible boss, hides behind ex-KGB guards and corrupt officials, and no one dares get close. Then there's Vito Genovese, the ruthless mafia don, who surrounds himself with killers, bribed cops, and an ironclad empire. These mafia bosses are not only so rich and powerful, but also the most wanted men in the world. Who else is too dangerous to reach? Let's find out. Semion Mogilevich. Life as a mafia boss is never easy. Every moment is a game of survival. The constant fear of getting caught or becoming a target keeps them on edge, forcing them to surround themselves with tight security. For someone like Semion Mogilevich, this isn't just a precaution, it's a necessity. The grand don of world crime bosses has to be Semion Mogilevich of Russia. His nicknames include Brainy Don and Boss of Bosses. Some observers see him more as the Russian mob's top banker rather than a boss. He's been on the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives list since 2009, and the $100,000 reward for information leading to his arrest still stands. However, he is known to reside in Moscow. Interpol also lists Mogilevich on its inventory of Europe's most wanted. Born in Ukraine in 1946, Semion Mogilevich began his criminal career in the early 1970s by joining the Soviet Union's Lyubertskaya crime clan. After learning the trade, he established his own syndicate, the Solntsevskaya gang. He funneled the stolen money into both criminal and legitimate businesses. In the 1990s, he expanded his operations to Canada, founding YBM Magnex International, a fraudulent magnet manufacturing company near Philadelphia. Without ever setting foot in the city, he scammed investors out of $150 million. He's also sought for questioning in alleged murder-for-hire schemes and dealing in drugs and firearms. Russian officials accused him in 1999 of using offshore companies to launder $500 million through the Bank of New York, but that was before the Putin era. He still remains a free man in Russia, almost certainly thanks to protection by ex-KGB guards and from friends in high places. After Semion Mogilevich, Vincent Mad Dog Coll is next on the list, an Irish mobster known for his sharp intellect and ruthless nature. Vincent Mad Dog Coll. One of the most notorious Irish gangsters of the Prohibition era was Vincent Mad Dog Coll. The extreme nature of his criminal operations left him with no choice but to surround himself with an ironclad security force, always on high alert to shield him from assassination attempts and sudden attacks. A handsome and intelligent man, Vincent was also a cold-hearted killer who some believed was psychotic, and in his short life, he left a legacy of gangland killings, kidnapping, and the murder of a 5-year-old child. After the murder, the media called him the worst criminal in America, and the FBI named him as #1 on its famed 10 Most Wanted list. In the violent, poverty-stricken era of 1920s New York, Coll was not afraid to do whatever it took to rise to the top of the gangster tree. His aggressive and volatile personality made him a man to be feared, and his willingness to murder to get what he wanted made him a trusted lieutenant of Schultz. Seeking money to fund his increasingly extravagant lifestyle, Coll began operating on his own and robbed the Sheffield Farms dairy in the Bronx of $17,000 without Schultz's authorization or permission. Despite the risks, Vincent didn't hesitate to accept a $50,000 contract to kill Lucky Luciano, the highest price ever offered for a single mob hit at the time. However, Luciano, though amused by the bounty on his own head, was quick to strike back. In retaliation, Madden put an identical $50,000 price on Coll's head. Eventually, Vincent Mad Dog Coll was gunned down in a phone booth on February 8, 1932, in a mob-ordered execution. Moving forward, we have Vito Genovese, a mafia boss who stopped at nothing to seize power, even if it meant betraying his own allies. Vito Genovese. Money and power don't always bring security. In fact, they often create paranoia. This was especially true for Vito Genovese, who despite his influence lived in constant fear. To him, nothing was more important than his own protection. For decades, Vito Genovese was practically synonymous with the American Mafia itself. Born in rural Italy at the tail end of the 1800s, he immigrated to New York City as a teenager and shaped its criminal elements as a young man. After killing his way to the top, he not only controlled organized crime, but helped shape its modern hierarchies. Vito Genovese rose through the ranks of the Mafia after becoming Charles Lucky Luciano's right-hand man. Initially hired by Joe the Boss Masseria during the Prohibition era, Genovese played a key role in the bootlegging and smuggling operations with Luciano and Frank Costello. His criminal activities expanded, and in 1930 he was charged with counterfeiting after police discovered $1 million in fake currency in his warehouse. That same year, Genovese carried out the murder of mobster Tommy Reyna under Masseria's orders. A crime that ignited the bloody Castellammarese War. In 1934, Genovese and fellow mobster Ferdinand Boccia cheated a gambler out of $150,000. When Boccia demanded a larger share than agreed upon, Genovese murdered him at a coffee shop. In 1943, he ordered the murder of journalist Carlo Tresca for his anti-Mussolini coverage. When it was discovered that he was wanted for murder in the United States, he was extradited on June 1, 1945. From ordering murders of competing mobsters to those he deemed informants, Genovese stayed in charge until he died of a heart attack on February 14, 1969. Just like Vincent, Carlo Gambino's rise to mafia power was fueled by quiet cunning, patience, and a strong drive for control. Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino led the Gambino family, widely regarded as the largest and most powerful in the nation, while also wielding significant influence over the other 4 New York crime families. This made him a prime target for external threats, prompting his family to ensure he was always heavily guarded. If you met Carlo Gambino on the street, you might not guess that he was a powerful mob boss. Quiet, understated, and known for offering FBI agents coffee and dessert when they visited him at home, Gambino was nevertheless cunning and cold-blooded like few other bosses before or since. By the time he died of natural causes at the age of 74 in 1976, he'd climbed through the ranks of the mob to become one of the Mafia's most powerful and wealthy leaders. Carlo Gambino grew up in a Mafia-controlled neighborhood where even police feared to enter. Moving to Brooklyn in the 1920s, he joined Joe Masseria's gang. After Masseria's death during the Castellammarese War, Gambino worked for his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, and later joined the Mangano family. When Albert Anastasia took over the Mangano family, Gambino remained loyal until the 1950s, when Anastasia violated the Mafia code by ordering a hit on a civilian. In response, Gambino orchestrated Anastasia's murder on October 25, 1957, and took control of the family as its new boss. The New York Times reports that his family had as many as 1,000 men involved in gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, narcotics, and labor racketeering up and down the eastern seaboard. Next, we have Al Capone, whose name still resonates as one of history's most notorious criminals, ruling Chicago with unmatched power. Al Capone. Al Capone was not only one of the wealthiest, but also one of the most feared mafia bosses, relentlessly expanding his criminal empire. He never compromised on his security, surrounding himself with a highly loyal team of bodyguards. Al Capone, born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, remains one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Dubbed Public Enemy Number 1, Capone expanded Chicago's underworld through extreme violence and corruption. In the 1920s, during Prohibition, he seized control of Chicago's bootlegging operations, turning his criminal empire into one of the largest and most profitable in the country. Before turning 21, Capone was involved in several violent incidents, including getting slashed across the cheek by Frank Galluccio at the Harvard Inn, earning the nickname Scarface. He also shot and killed a man during a robbery and was questioned by the police but released due to lack of witnesses. After brutally killing a member of the White Hand Gang, Capone was sent to Chicago by his mentor, Johnny Torrio, to avoid retribution and work for Torrio's criminal empire. In 1924, Al Capone killed Joe Howard to get revenge because Howard had earlier killed one of Capone's friends. In 1927, Capone's wealth was estimated at nearly $100 million, an astonishing sum for that era. Many Americans were fascinated by the larger-than-life image of Capone. Al Capone was involved in the most infamous of the bloodlettings, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang were machine-gunned down in a garage on Chicago's north side on February 14, 1929. Al Capone's criminal empire laid the foundation for the mob world, which would later pull figures like Henry Hill into its dangerous grip. Henry Hill. Henry Hill's life was always at risk because of his important role in organized crime and his decision to betray his old friends. This made him a target for revenge, so he needed tight security to stay safe. Henry Hill was a member of the Lucchese crime family who became a federal informant, inspiring the Martin Scorsese movie Goodfellas. Though Goodfellas depicts Henry Hill saying, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster," the real-life Hill later said, "I actually wanted to be a priest, but that didn't work out." By the time Henry Hill met his future wife wife Karen Friedman in 1965 through Vario, Hill had taken the next steps in his criminal career. Mostly this involved arson, hijacking trucks, assault, credit card fraud, and extortion. Hill was eventually included in high-profile criminal operations, including an April 1967 robbery at the Air France cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport alongside Tommy DeSimone. It was a clean operation, no one put on alert, no guns drawn, that resulted in the two walking away with a grand total of $420,000. Then, in 1978, Henry Hill took part in the infamous Lufthansa heist, orchestrated by Jimmy Burke. The robbery, which occurred at JFK Airport, was completed in just 64 minutes, stealing $5 million in cash and $1 million in jewelry. Henry Hill met a relatively quiet end on June 12, 2012, after suffering from heart disease. He died the day after his birthday. Few men have changed the criminal underworld as much as Lucky Luciano, the mastermind behind the modern mafia. Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano's immense power and wealth made him a target, forcing him to think beyond just influence. He needed protection. Instead of relying solely on his own men, he formed strategic alliances with other gangs, even utilizing their members to safeguard his position. This not only strengthened his empire, but also ensured that no single group could easily bring him down. Long before he was called Lucky, Charles Luciano was born as Salvatore Lucania in Sicily. He and his family moved to New York City when Luciano was around the age of 10, and Luciano struggled in school but thrived among the criminal element of the Lower East Side. He also allegedly earned the nickname Lucky in 1929 when he survived a brutal attack from fellow gangsters. They beat him, stabbed him, and slit his throat. Luciano led a group of young Italian and Jewish mobsters against the older set of so-called Mustache Petes, and in the process, set the stage for the mob to grow beyond the limits of bootlegging profits to become, in the words of his friend Meyer Lansky, bigger than United States Steel. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was reportedly making millions in bootlegging profits. He lived the high life as a mafia boss and de facto commission head for several years, but was convicted of extortion and prostitution in 1936 and deported back to Italy in 1946. Despite his violent life, Lucky Luciano didn't die at the hands of another mob boss, but instead of a fatal heart attack that struck on January 26, 1962, just before Italian authorities intended to arrest him for drug trafficking. Our list continues to Joe Bonanno, the mobster who inspired the Godfather movie, led the Bonanno crime family, and became one of New York's most powerful mafia bosses. Joe Bonanno. Like Lucky Luciano and several other famous mob bosses, Joe Bonanno rose to power after the Castellano War. Unlike other bosses, however, Bonanno wrote a tell-all autobiography. He violated omerta, the mafia code of silence and secrecy, yet Bonanno was able to live out his days in peace for another 20 years. Born in Sicily, Bonanno immigrated to New York City at a young age but spent just 10 years in the U.S. before his family returned to Italy. There, he came of age in the Sicilian Mafia and returned to New York City in 1924 as Mussolini cracked down on organized crime. 26 years old, Bonanno took control over the Maranzano family, which later became the Bonanno family. For nearly a 30-year period after the Castellano War, no internal squabbles marred the unity of our family, and no outside interference threatened the family or me, Bonanno later wrote. Joe Bonanno started to run into trouble in the 1960s. Then the New York Times reports that his fellow mafia bosses, Tommy Three Finger Brown Lucchese and Carlo Gambino, learned that Bonanno was planning to assassinate them in order to consolidate his power. As his problems mounted, he simply disappeared. For 19 months, the FBI, Interpol, CIA, and the Italian and French secret services try to understand if he is alive or dead. In 1966, Bonanno surrendered to the authorities, and after a heart attack in 1968, he preferred to retire from his mob life with his son Salvatore at his home in Arizona. Bonanno died at his home on May 12, 2002, aged 97. Just like Joe Bannon, next we have Frank Costello, who knew that power wasn't just about muscle, it was about influence. Frank Costello. The fictional Don Corleone bore a strong resemblance to the real-life mob boss Frank Costello in more ways than one. Like Corleone, Costello was born in Italy in 1891. Both men made their way to the United States at a young age, where both changed their names. Both rose through the ranks of the American Mafia to become powerful bosses. In their own right, Costello, who aligned himself with Lucky Luciano early on, benefited by Luciano's ascension after the Castellano War by becoming a consigliere of the Luciano family. But then Luciano was was deported and his underboss, Vito Genovese, fled to Italy to avoid prosecution. In their absence, Costello became the boss of what became known as the Genovese family. With his booming slot machine business in New Orleans and the illegal gambling rings he had set up in Florida and Cuba, Frank Costello became one of the most profitable members of the Mafia. He was nearly assassinated by Genovese in 1957, who wanted to retake control of the family and soon afterwards agreed to cede power. Despite no longer being the boss of bosses, Frank Costello retained a certain air of respect even after his retirement. Associates still referred to him as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and many bosses, capos, and consiglieres paid visits to his Waldorf Astoria penthouse to seek his counsel on Mafia family matters. Nevertheless, Frank Costello died a rich man at the old age of 82 in 1973. Like Gambino, he passed away at home. Our list continues to Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho, who built one of the most feared cartels in the world, but his rise came at a deadly cost. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. Being a mafia boss means making more enemies than friends, and Mencho knows this all too well. The constant threat to his life forces him to take extreme precautions, surrounding himself with tight security and staying steps ahead of those who want to take him down. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, alias El Mencho, is the founder and leader of the Jalisco cartel New Generation and was at the forefront of transforming what was once a fledgling criminal faction into one of the most fearsome criminal groups in Mexico. In the process, he has become one of Mexico's most wanted criminals, for whom U.S. authorities are offering a $15 million reward. Under El Mencho's command, the CJN began to expand and consolidate its control over drug trafficking in Jalisco and neighboring states, taking on rival cartels the Zetas and the Knights Templar. The CJN is also believed to have been behind the murder of Congressman Gabriel Gómez Michel in September 2014. Although the motive is unknown, Gómez Michel had been mayor of El Grulo, a CJNG stronghold in Jalisco state, where El Mencho allegedly moves freely. Because he maintains a low profile and has not been identified by authorities for several years, rumors of his death have surfaced. For example, in February 2022, various reports in the Mexican press stated that El Mencho had been killed in a CJNG confrontation with some of his rivals. Another rumor, spread by CJN enemies on scrawled messages left around Guadalajara, stated that El Mencho had died of kidney failure in a hospital in that city. U.S. authorities believe he is still alive, and in December 2024, they increased the reward they were offering for information leading to his capture to $15 million. After El Mencho, Paul Castellano wasn't just a mafia boss. He saw himself as a businessman. Paul Castellano. Though Gambino family kingpin Paul Castellano did plenty in his time as a mob boss, he remains best known for his shocking 1985 murder at the hands of his soon-to-be famous underling John Gotti. At the time, Castellano was seen as the godfather or the boss of bosses because the Gambino family was the most powerful organization in New York. However, some also called him the Howard Hughes of the Mafia because of his reclusive nature, which could rub capos and soldiers in the Gambino family the wrong way. His organization infiltrated labor unions and such businesses as building construction and food supply, extorting money from legitimate enterprises while also operating traditional rackets such as gambling, pornography, and loan sharking. Although Castellano preferred a businessman-like approach to crime, violence was still a key tool in maintaining power. He ordered numerous murders to eliminate rivals and maintain control. One of the most infamous cases linked to him was the murder of Gambino soldier Roy DeMeo, who ran a brutal operation known for carrying out hundreds of killings. When DeMeo became a liability, Castellano had him executed. To conceal his vast illegal earnings, Castellano engaged in large-scale tax fraud and money laundering schemes. He used fake businesses, shell companies, and offshore accounts to move money and avoid detection by authorities. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti were killed in a hail of bullets as they arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. To this day, it remains one of the most infamous mob hits of all time. Let's take you to Chicago, where Sam Giancana's reign of terror kept the city in fear for years. Sam Giancana. Mafia bosses may spread fear, but few realize that they themselves live in constant fear of being caught or taken down by rivals. Sam Giancana was no different. He prioritized his security above all else, knowing that one wrong move could cost him everything. Sam Giancana made a name for himself in Chicago's underworld and became even more famous for his secret ties to President John F. Kennedy. Giancana grew up in a rough part of Chicago and later led a gang of local youths known as the 42 Gang. Giancana's association with the 42 Gang resulted in a long rap sheet, but it also caught the attention of Al Capone. Their fellow gangster Tony Montana told the Los Angeles Times in 2014 that Giancana and the gang were robbing and shaking down so many joints that Capone took notice of them. Giancana steadily climbed through the ranks of the Chicago underworld, even after Capone went to prison in 1931. Connected to John F. Kennedy through Kennedy's alleged mistress Judith Exner, Giancana and his associates allegedly helped Kennedy get elected in 1960 by stuffing ballot boxes in Chicago. Giancana was also allegedly involved in plots to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro, whom the mob despised for shutting down mob-run casinos in Cuba, and even in the assassination of Kennedy himself in November 1963. The United States House Select Committee on Assassinations even sought to interrogate Giancana about his possible involvement in the Kennedy assassination, but on June 19, 1975, Giancana was murdered by an unknown assailant while cooking dinner at home. To date, no one knows if Giancana was murdered by fellow mobsters, jealous ex-girlfriends, CIA agents, or someone else entirely. Moving forward, we have Vincent Gigante, who was no ordinary mafia boss. He controlled the underworld from the shadows while convincing everyone he had lost his mind. Vincent Gigante. Starting in the 1960s, New Yorkers living in Greenwich Village became familiar with a stooped figure who'd shuffle down the street in a bathrobe. The man appeared to be mentally unstable, but he was not what he seemed. His name was Vincent the Chin Gigante, and he was actually a mob boss who faked insanity to avoid jail time. Genovese became the head of the Luciano family, renamed the Genovese family, and Gigante followed in his footsteps in the 1980s. By then, Gigante had begun his infamous insanity charade. Because he knew he was under police surveillance, the mob boss would wander around his New York neighborhood in a bathrobe and feign mental illness. Gigante was responsible for numerous murders and assassination attempts to maintain his power and eliminate threats. One of his most infamous crimes was the 1957 failed hit on Frank Costello, the former boss of the Genovese family. Costello survived the attack, but the incident forced him into retirement, allowing Gigante's mentor, Vito Genovese, to take control. As a boss, Gigante ordered hits on rivals, traitors, and anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Gigante used his wealth and power to bribe police officers, judges, and politicians, making it difficult for authorities to build a case against him. His ability to manipulate the system allowed him to run the Genovese family for decades without facing serious legal consequences. Despite his careful planning, Vincent Gigante's criminal empire eventually crumbled. He was sentenced to prison, where he finally admitted that his insanity act was nothing more than a scheme to evade justice. Gigante died in 2005. The next mafia boss on our list took security to another level: Joe Profaci, a leader who ruled with an iron fist and surrounded himself with extreme protection. Joe Profaci. Security was something he never compromised on. Knowing that his wealth and power made him a target, Joe Profaci ensured he was always protected. Born in Sicily in 1897, Profaci was allegedly involved with the Italian Mafia from a young age. In the 1920s, he made his way to New York City, where Profaci used his old ties to make new connections with the burgeoning New York mob. By 1930, Profaci was controlling numbers, prostitution, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking in Brooklyn. In 1930, the Castellamorese War broke out in New York City. Some sources say that Profaci remained neutral, while others say that Profaci was firmly aligned with Castellamorese boss Salvatore Maranzano. By the 1940s, he became head of the Profaci family, which was one of the 5 original crime families. Profaci was especially known for his successful olive oil business, which he used as a legitimate front for his more illicit activities. But Profaci wasn't as adept at keeping the peace as Corleone. His insistence on collecting a monthly fee from his fellow gang members led to the bloody Profaci Gallo War in 1960, with the rebel faction spearheaded by the infamous Crazy Joe Gallo. The war resulted in murders on both sides. In early 1962, Carlo Gambino and Lucchese crime family boss Tommy Lucchese tried to convince Profaci to resign to end the gang war. However, Profaci strongly suspected that the two bosses were secretly supporting the Gallo brothers and wanted to take control of his family. Profaci died of natural causes in 1962 as the Profaci Gallo War continued to rage. He thus boss didn't live to see the Profaci family become the Colombo family when Joseph Colombo became boss in 1963. The final name on our list is none other than John Gotti, the flashy and fearless mafia boss who dominated the underworld. John Gotti.
How come you don't put the earphones on?
I like Julio Iglesias.
The infamous mafia boss of the Gambino crime family, John Gotti earned the nickname the Dapper Don for his flamboyant style and public persona. Gotti rose up the ranks of the Gambino crime family quickly, but often found himself at odds with its boss, Paul Big Paulie Castellano. Castellano reportedly was furious with Gotti's alleged drug dealing and flashy nature, while Gotti was said to take issue with Castellano's greed. Gotti's mentor Della Croce, an underboss overseeing 10 of the 23 family crews, served as a buffer between Castellano and Gotti until Della Croce's death from cancer in 1971. 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, Gotti arranged the murder of Castellano outside of Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. 4 men in trench coats and Russian hats ambushed Castellano and his close associate Thomas Bellotti, both of whom died from gunshot wounds. Under Gotti's leadership, the Gambino crime family was involved in numerous murders. Anyone who posed a threat, whether rival gangsters or disloyal members, was swiftly eliminated. His enforcer Gravano later admitted to participating in 19 murders under Gotti's command. In 1992, Gotti's luck ran out. His underboss, Sammy Gravano, turned government witness, providing testimony that led to Gotti's conviction. He was found guilty of multiple crimes, including 5 murders, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. Sentenced to life in prison without parole, Gotti spent the rest of his days behind bars at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, until Gotti died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002. These mafia bosses built empires and surrounded themselves with heavy security, yet fear never left their side. Do you think anyone can truly escape their fate? Share your thoughts and click on the cards for more intriguing videos.